All right, today, quiet. Today we roll into review. Maybe our second to last review. Maybe we'll get a couple more in there. We're going to do two timelines today. I really think it covers about three of our chapters. They are not like French Rev, wars. A lot of stuff actually happened, but there is a significant amount of key concepts brought up in here, and these we might not have studied as much during the regular year as we would have. So some of the things that Napoleon did, or some of the stuff of World War I or World War II. So please keep that in mind as you listen today and as you study. All right. If we look at the Industrial Rev, we really have to look at, obviously, is where we start out with, is what eras came before, right? What eras come before Industrial Rev that are relevant right now? Agricultural Rev, of course. We're going to start with that. That is easily the most important. You can go back even further and mention exploration. Right? What's another big era for the Industrial Rev?
Scientific.
I'd say scientific revolution, right? I mean, so many of the inventions, even though the steam engine isn't a key concept, you guys will remember that. Remember its importance. And also in the background during this time, the French Revolution is going on, right? Late 1700s, into the 1800s, we have Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. The Industrial Rev is going on in the background of this era. Right? Some of the eras it comes after, some of the things that it'll directly affect. What's the biggest one? Industrialization. Factories is going to lead directly to what? Maybe urbanization. You can put that as a cluster. Jobs, sure. What era? What do you need when you have factories? No. What does a country need when they have factories? They need imperialism. They need other countries, colonies, so that they can gather the resources. But more importantly, why do you need colonies? So you can sell, so you can market, mercantilism, right? So we can get rid of it. Some of the clusters that I think are significant. There's not too many I could pick from, though. There's plenty more. If you have one in your head that helps it understand, go ahead. First off, we are starting really in the 1700s. We get into this era that this is truly British-led. This is truly British-led. Britain has been the most powerful country for a while. Because of industrialization, Great Britain will become the dominant country. And why do they become the dominant country of Europe in the 1700s and then take over and solidify their control in industrial revolution and then become even more power in the imperialism? Why? What happens if we have to point to a starting point? Not the Spanish War, Spanish succession, but you're on the right idea. I'd say in the 1760s, what did we see? When France declined and England rose. The 7 Years' War, right? The 7 Years' War is really where I think we can mark this dominant. So to start out, we look at the agricultural revolution, and these dates, timelines here aren't perfectly exact, but you can say the Industrial Revolution the Agricultural Revolution should come right here. And the primary result of the Agricultural Revolution is what? Food, right? And when we get more food in society, some things happen. What is number one? Babies. That's my way of putting it, but what actually happens if we're talking human geo and people eat more food? How do we end up with more babies?
Less infant mortality rate.
Biggest thing, infant mortality rate will drop if there is food for the children, but more importantly, there is food for a healthy mother to give birth to a healthy, not underweight, not starving child. These babies are going to die left. Infant mortality rate is the number of babies that die before their first birthday, which has such a big impact. Why? Because what's high in addition to the infant mortality rate? Remember the total fertility rate? It's the number of children a woman will have. Women are used to having in Europe 5 or 6 children because 3 or 4 of them will die before their first birthday. You end up raising 2 or 3 kids, right? Well, now we can assume we're going to end up raising 5 or 6 of those 5 or 6 kids. And that's when our population goes, boom. Right? So, also life expectancy. If we have healthy people living longer, then we are going to have a much significant higher population. The other big outcome of the agricultural revolution that kind of feeds directly into the industrial rev was what? You say proletarianization, which is when people leave the countryside and start working for wages. Absolutely. We've talked about that in other timelines, so I won't put it up here. But people are no longer producing food for themselves. They are working to earn money so that they can buy other food. What'd you say? Closure, I think that comes earlier on, even though that's certainly part of this. Urbanization. People start flocking to cities. The primary reason they start flocking to cities is why? Same reason anybody migrates, is for jobs. Now, there aren't a lot of jobs in the cities, but I can guarantee there's none in the countrysides because of enclosure. The elites run the new farms. So with urbanization, primarily for jobs, what are the challenges? What challenges do we run into in the agricultural rev and maybe even industrial rev? Well, definitely industrial revolution because of urbanization. What are the challenges? Yeah. Lower living standards. Right? Overcrowding. What else? Disease. I would put sanitation. We don't know how to get rid of human waste, or we don't know how to provide food that far deep in the city. We don't have refrigerators, so people get sick. Crime. Definitely have crime. That's probably the biggest point from the College Board. That crime rises when you have overcrowding. And that's not just a industrial rev, AP Euro thing. That is simple fact. You go to overcrowded areas and crime goes on the rise. You can also put in prostitution, which the College Board mentions. Now, how do we solve these problems? How do we solve them today? What did you say? Social programs? Maybe. We talked a couple units ago during the agricultural rev, maybe the end of it. The way we solve things like prostitution, lying, cheating, stealing is public humiliation, usually led by the church, right? You could have stocks out. They could be put on trial in public. The way you solve it in big cities is the same way you solve it today. How do you stop crime in big cities? The government gets involved, raises a police force to keep order. So police becomes a lot bigger because of crime, because of sanitation, prostitution. So more government, bigger government. Then, around here-ish, we end up with the Industrial Revolution. I do want to know, what's the most important sign that the Industrial Revolution affected society? Comes in the 19-teens. World War I. All right, that's the true sign that we are industrialized, or all of Europe is industrialized. Now, there's going to be some stuff this is a real simple column because we'll talk about most of it when we talk about countries. But when you talk about industrial rev early on, who are you talking about? Britain, right? You're talking about England above all else. But the one that I want to highlight in here because, to be honest, I think it's our second cluster. What's the primary outcome on society when we move to the Industrial Revolution? How does society change? Not living standards, though. That's you're right, but not my cluster. Living standards will go up eventually, right? But they really suck for who for a while? I think classes. Right? So we end up with new social classes. And guys, what are we going to call these two new social classes? Workers. Not the workers and the owners. The bourgeoisie and proletariat. When I say this, who do you associate with the bourgeoisie and proletariat? Russia maybe, but Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto is the one who really outlines that the history of the world is the history of class struggles. You can even put right here, instead of classes, maybe class struggles. might be a better term. You'll see it here. Our next unit is about the 1800s politics. It's about how people, conservatives and liberals kind of struggled for power back and forth. So within the bourgeoisie and proletariat, the bourgeoisie are the owners, are the rich, they're the people who own the means of production. They're new elites, if you will. The proletariat are the workers. And the proletariats are going to feel, and many times, that they are not being respected. Because of these new social classes and proletariats, we see the rise of the workers. And when workers get together and want power, what do? Union. Okay? Union. We'll talk about socialism in the next unit. One good thing I want you to put down here. Workers form unions, and then we see socialism. What do we call these new social classes? How does Marx describe them in his Communist Manifesto, even though it's an older term? Division of labor. Write that term down. Division of labor. New social classes, new way of dividing wealth. In the Industrial Revolution, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Now, this is mostly led, as I said, by Britain. British dominance. And a great essay question, or a great factor that I guarantee will be on your test on May 6th is, why does Britain dominate? What's the reason? They're an island. So they're not in a war at the time. That's a big one, right? I mean, guys, I told you one of the things that comes before is the French Rev. When's the French Rev on here? Late 1790s. Napoleon is in charge till, 1814? Then we see the Congress of... France isn't going to industrialize then. They're in complete and utter political and social chaos. They don't have a shot at industrialization. And without without France in the way, Britain, boom, is able to take everything. So they're on their own, no wars. What else?
A lot of coal.
A lot of coal. Resources. Even though you're right, by the way, like the war, even though you're right, I'm only putting key concept terms up here, right? Only what the College Board has written down. What resources in particular? Coal and not steel. That's not a resource. What do you need to make steel? Iron. Eventually, we'll see steel. Okay. Another reason that they jump ahead is even though they stay as a private investment, even though these are private companies that invest, they are heavily supported by Parliament. Why does Parliament support the elites who want to build more factories and create goods? Because it's them. They are the elites. They vote to help themselves invest in industry so that they themselves can make money, which is, a bit questionable, but still smart. Because of this, we get inventors. We get capitalists. And maybe the biggest help that England has is they are able to get private and public investors. They have places with lots of money. They can handle giving out loans to build new factories. Because England, unlike a lot of other countries in the 1700s, England has a what? England has a national bank. England has a national bank where they can get money from. Our almost last point for Great Britain is, what is the process? What is the process of industrialization? What's the first industrial good? Textiles. Right? First railroad is between the textile haven of Manchester and transportation hub of Liverpool. Right? Textiles is first. With textiles, with the money, they develop the iron or the steel industry And what's the most important thing they build with that iron and steel? And they are better than anybody else at it. Locomotives. Transportation. Transportation. Even though not only the locomotive invented in the UK, right, with the steam engine, but even when like America invents the steamboat, Britain is the first European country to lash onto it. So that is British dominance. And to end British dominance, we have to figure out how or why it actually spreads to the rest of the world, or rest of Europe. And what spreads the Industrial Revolution to the rest of Europe?
World's Fair.
What?
The World's Fair.
The World's Fair. 1851, we had right here, what did we call that World's Fair? Great Exhibition. And the College Board goes out of its way to mention one thing about that World's Fair, which is what? Crystal Palace. The whole world showed up to Hyde Park, England, just out of London. And while they were there, England showed off why they were technologically far more powerful than the rest of the world. So the rest of Europe, we're going to look at two countries. This is not, what I'm writing here is not technically on the timeline. It's just, it's right here. Okay? So let's go country by country. First up is France. They industrialize when they show up, see the Crystal Palace, and come back. And we're talking 1850s now here. You know, they start a little earlier, but Napoleon is dead and gone 1815. Well, he's exiled in 1815. Then we have the Bourbons rule. In 1830, we have a revolution where they try to... And in 1848, they have another revolution where they finally put Napoleon III in charge, and the whole country calms down. That's what my next unit's about. Okay? So finally, they show up at the Crystal Palace, and they want to industrialize. Why are they limited? First off, until we have Napoleon, they do not have a central bank. They do not have a central bank. And most of the elites in France are what kind of elites? They're the old nobles. If you're the old fat noble sitting in your castle, do you want to invest in business? Why? Why don't you? No reason to. You have so much power and gold and money and legal rights that even after the French rep, there's no reason to invest. Now, what's the biggest difference? And one of the reasons France is able to develop so quickly once they start. In Britain, it is mostly private citizens with some help from Parliament that industrializes. In France, it is government help or government-led. And what's the number one thing the government can do to promote industrialization? Transportation. Subsidize the railroad. What's another form of transportation they can build? Canals. The government builds those, and then the central bank that Napoleon puts into place in the early 1800s gets on its feet and starts giving out help, starts investing in factories. The other country in Europe that we're going to look at that industrialization plays a huge factor on, you know? Prussia. Germany's not a country, but we'll go Prussia in the Germanic region. They take a while to industrialize. Keep in mind, Prussia is, around. There's the old economic region. Germany unifies when? 1871. One of those dates I want you to know. One of maybe 5 dates I want you to absolutely memorize on this test. Prussia is the ultimate industrialization opposite of Great Britain. Put a big star next to government-led or government helped along. The government really designs, promotes, and puts into place the Industrial Revolution in Prussia and Germany. And so we see rapid industrialization, not just normal industrialization, rapid. Maybe the fastest in history until we get to Stalin in the 1930s in Russia. All right? Now, one way they can help, all right, let me ask this. What's the biggest way a government can spur on the industrial rep? Railroads. Another thing they can do, the whole background behind Prussian industrialism in the early and mid-1800s is that we're all leading towards what? One unified Germany, right? Do you remember one of those first steps? The economic union of Germany? Yeah. Zollverein. I don't know how to spell it. Good enough. The Zollverein, which is German unification, it removes tariffs in between these borders. And we're almost done. The last guy you should know, gray box, is Friedrich List. I'm not sure that we talked about him much in class. But Friedrich List comes up with an opposing idea to Adam Smith's liberalism. Adam Smith said we should have a free market. We should have individual capitalism and an individually led economy. Friedrich List says we should have a national system. Instead of being led by individuals and private countries, we should have private companies. Adam Smith, individuals, private companies. Friedrich List says we need to have the nations take charge and the nations to lead. I bring this up because when they sit down, this is class from last week in your essay, for most of my classes. When they sat down and decided what to do with Europe after World War II, they looked at Friedrich List. They looked at this national system and they developed what economic environment for Europe? The common market. They put this in the College Board. It's the European Economic Community. The common market comes from Friedrich List. The last side we need to talk about is Eastern Europe. How does Eastern Europe do with industrialization? Just put a big frowny face. All right? We're thinking of Russia specifically. You know, Russia is backwards until the 1900s. Why don't they? What are their biggest obstacles? Number one. I think number one, let's mirror what happens in Great Britain. Number one, they don't have good resources. What does Russia have a lot on? What's Russia's number one export? Oil, which does not help. In the early Industrial Revolution, it's coal that does. They don't have a lot of oil, they don't have a lot of iron. The other reason is the elites. In Great Britain, they actually encourage the Industrial Revolution. In France and Prussia, they don't have that big an impact limiting. In France, they essentially still have serfdom. They are still feudal. They're still an agrarian society. The governments there are not strong enough. They're not strong enough. Prussia actually has a lot of the problems that Russia does, but in Prussia, the government is powerful enough to overcome these limitations. And that is Industrial Rev. I have my timelines posted online if you want to check them out. Let's do a little bit shorter, but 1800 socialism. Flip to another side or a second timeline. All right, guys, we're running out of time. I only got about 10 minutes to go over this, so listen carefully. Before this era, by the way, 1800s conservative liberalism, what we're going to reference so you have it in the right mind, is we're going to talk about how Clemens von Metternich tried to return conservatism, have the old guard rule, and then we're going to talk about a lot of radicals and socialists that try to change it. All right. What's the art era in the background of this political struggle and in the background of the Industrial Revolution? My favorite, Romanticism. All right. We'll try to get to that at the end. So eras before or during this. French Rev, I think you really have to say ends kind of at the start of this era. It's really the biggest the biggest impact, the number one most liberal guy in world history, you could argue, is Napoleon Bonaparte. And not only did he make France liberal, but he tried to spread liberalism. All right? So French Revolution and Napoleon, key, yeah. Congress of Vienna is 1815. And you know that's the death. That's the transition between Napoleon and conservatives. Enlightenment, especially with individual rights, we're going to reference a couple times, and industrialism is going on in the background. After it, big era after 1850 is the eras of nationalism. Italy unifies in 1861, Germany in 1871. The era that nationalism leads to is what? You group nationalism and industrialism, and you get World War I. Good. And then finally, imperialism will also be kind of in the background. The cluster for this, I could only pick one, and that's very simple. Class struggle. So much of what the Industrial Rev does here is about class struggle. Now, to break this up, we're just going to talk about each group. This is not on the timeline. Up here will be on the timeline. I'll mention the people down here. Let's just talk about politics. Conservatism. They wanted a traditional. They wanted traditional authority, right? The religious and political authority. You might not have time to write all this down, and if you can't read it, please go back and look at my sites. The most important conservative at this time is Metternich. He's from Austria, right? Austria is the most old-fashioned. Why? The Habsburgs, okay? He sets up the most important event of this, the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna in 1815. Congress of Vienna was politically about restoring what? Balance of power. But more importantly, and I mentioned this briefly, he sets up something that we call the Concert of Europe or the Congress. The Congress system. What the Congress system is led by Metternich. He says, all the countries, all the rulers that want conservative to rule, we will collectively go around Europe and squash liberals. Every time somebody whines about freedom or voting rights, Prussia and Austria and Russia and the Bourbons in France will show up with their own armies and crush those people. It's a way to keep liberalism in check. The only other conservative I would note is a guy in England writing during the French Rev who hated the French Rev, Burke. Edmund, B-U-R-K-E. Edmund Burke. He wanted traditional conservatism, and he is the English voice against the violence and craziness and liberalism of the French Rev. Next group. Let's do the liberals. You want to draw a line? You don't have to draw this, but conservatives, liberals. Where we are right now, we just talked about really conservative people. Now we're going to talk about liberals. Right here. So what do liberals want? Enlightenment idea, they want individual rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the most important of the individual rights for a government to recognize is what? What's the most important individual right? Vote. And what do we say when everybody votes?
Universal manhood.
No. We'll get there. That's even more crazy. Popular sovereignty. Remember that term from last year? Popular sovereignty, meaning everybody can vote. This is heavy. Liberals are heavy from the Enlightenment. They talk about enlightened self-interest. That's a key box term. Enlightened self-interest. Where I need to think about my own life and my own impact. Some important liberals. In the 1820s, we had a guy named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham came up with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that we need to have the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Also, writing with Bentham is a guy named John Stuart Mill. Remember that name? John Stuart Mill. He talked about the freedom of the individual, the freedom of individual expression, the importance of voting, and the power that a single man can and should have on society. The other one over here, a white box term from England, is during the Napoleonic era. the government put in these corn laws which protected its own growers, its own farmers. But who are the farmers now in the 1800s? The elites, the rich. So these old corn laws are protecting the nobility. So the Anti-Corn Law League is a perfect, if not the best example of liberalism in this time period. They protest against the corn laws because the corn laws are protecting the old way of society, the old system of nobles. Our next group are the radicals, right? They're even farther to the left. They are they talk about universal manhood suffrage. Universal manhood. Everybody should be able to vote. The poorest of the poor, whether they own land, have wealth, or are educated in the least bit. With the radicals, let's put the most important group. Socialists. Socialists are all about the distribution of wealth, the division of labor. Who's their god? One term you'll see here is Marxist scientific socialism. The idea that Marx used the scientific method to truly figure out what is best with society, and what we see now are his followers. Two guys you should know. Maybe three. Right here, there's a guy named Henri Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon is a French guy who believes in socialism and believes in power to the workers. All that generic socialist stuff you know. The most important non-Marxist socialism is the guy who helps him write the Communist Manifesto. Engels. The Communist Manifesto, you know that book, was written in 1848. Not a required date, but that's a good way to place most of this. He is the best example of Marxist socialism. Absolute best example. Around this time, maybe more with radicals and universal manhood suffrage, England has something called the Chartist movement. Does that ring a bell at all? Chartist movement was about getting every man the right to vote. And lastly, in France, we had that July Revolution. The July Revolution overthrew the Bourbons, put his cousin, Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, in charge, and really just kind of shows us that the liberals are taking control of this government again. Our last point for the socialists is that at this time period, we see a rise of labor movements. We just might finish it. The rise of labor movements. What's the German Socialist Party? No. Social Democrats. You guys remember the Social Democrats? Right, they're the Socialist Party. What's the British Liberal Workers' Party? We actually talked about it in our last unit. The Labour Party. O-U-R, Labour Party. They start to take over and gain quite a significant amount of power. And our last point, from the late 1700s to its real popularity, 1800 to 1850, we see Romanticism. Guys, I'm only going to spend about 60 seconds on this, but please, if we rank the arts in what's on the test, Renaissance and then Romanticism is a clear number 2. It's the only one where they actually want you to know at least one painter, one composer, and one writer. What if you have to write one word for Romanticism? What's it about? Emotion. Emotion. Nature. Write down nature. Emotion and nature. It's all about individuality and the individual experiences. We are ending neoclassicalism, which is where we redid the Greek and Roman stuff. We are ending rationalism and that everything has to be perfect, and we are surrendering ourselves to emotion. The reason is the background of the Industrial Revolution. Life kind of sucks. So we have people like Constable. He would paint landscapes. And you could just sit and look at this romantic notion that life on the farm used to be wonderful. Do you remember the picture of the guy? He's standing on a rock facing the ocean and the waves are just pounding straight into his face. That is Romanticism. Constable, Constable. He's an artist. You should know him. The other one you should know is Turner, Turner. He is the guy who paints the seascapes. Not only is there contrasting colors because they're in a storm and people are drowning. And the guy who painted the French Rev. He's the guy who painted Napoleon on horseback. Very dramatic. He's the guy who painted Lady Liberty leading the people, where Lady Liberty had the group of workers and soldiers and politicians behind him, leading them over the dead bodies of the French Rev. That's Delacroix. 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 Last two things, composers and writers. Composers, what are the famous composers? There's four of them, you know them already. Tchaikovsky. Good luck spelling that. It's Tcha. If you want to write that, you'll know it. Tchaikovsky wrote the 1812 Overture. Remember that one with the cannons about Napoleon's advance? Very emotional. Beethoven. I'm going to give you the ones the College Board does, but you're all right. Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Chopin. Looks like Chopin, Chopin. Beethoven, Chopin, Tchaikovsky, and the German, besides Beethoven, Wagner, Wagner, Wagner. He's the one who composed the music for the Bugs Bunny cartoon. He's the one who writes Flight of the Valkyries, which you all recognize. Last three, writers. The most famous writers are William Wordsworth. He wrote that terrible poem called Daffodils. Who's the most famous female romantic writer? She writes about one of the greatest science fiction stories in history. Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley. Her name's not Frankenstein, or Mary Shelley. And the most famous novelist. Oh, your last thing, once you know him, we're done. Who's the most famous novelist of the Romanticism? This romantic idea that this ugly, disfigured man can find love and have impact. Hunchback of Notre Dame is written by Victor Hugo, the French guy. Thanks for coming, guys. I'll see you in class today.